All right, it's 10:01. We had about 78 people sign up, I think. Of course, you never get all the people who signed up, so I'm not expecting 78, but we're in the mid-20s now, so maybe I'll wait another minute or so just to give people a chance to arrive, and then we'll get started. And again, if you're just arriving, welcome. We're glad to have you here. Thank you for being here. If you are willing to turn on your camera and show us your face, that's great. Oh, Mark, you have a question?
It looks like this is being recorded. Will it be available in the future?
Yeah, it's a little complicated. The short answer is yes. We need to figure out how to make it available just for Duke people is the issue. I'm not, for complicated reasons, I'm not able to just post it for anyone in the world to see, but I am happy to make it available for Duke people. So we're going to have to figure out a way to do that using Box or something. So
I only ask because I'm going to have to leave at 11.
Oh, okay.
Jory, I will put it up on the Duke Science and Society YouTube. It's actually streaming live on YouTube now.
Okay.
So it will be available to anyone and everyone via our YouTube page at the end of the event. So I will make sure that we send that out to our list of RSVPs so everyone has access to that recording once I get Jory's approval.
Okay, great. Well, it's 3 minutes after. I think I'll go ahead and get started, even though people are still arriving. Welcome, everybody, to Broader Impacts 101. I am your MC and host for the day, Jory Weintraub. For those of you who don't know me, I recognize a lot of names here, but not all of them. For those of you who don't know me, I am based here at Duke. I am the Science Communication Director and a faculty member with the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. And I'm also the director of the Duke Broader Impacts Resource Center, or BERC, as we call it. That's half my job. The other half of my job currently is that I'm a co-PI of a national center called the Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society, or ARIS. ARIS is an NSF-funded Broader Impacts Center, and it's the first center funded by the NSF specifically to focus on broader impacts and research impacts. We've been funded now for, I think we're in our third year, and of a 5-year grant with plans to apply for a renewal for another 5 years. So I'm one of the co-PIs of that grant, and I'm the training director. I take the lead on most of the training activities for ARIS. So I sort of divide my time now between those two worlds. I'm 50% with each one. And I do a lot of trainings and workshops externally as part of ARIS, and at least once or twice a year, I try to do one internally for my colleagues here at Duke. And then in my role as the director of the Broader Impacts Resource Center at Duke, I am also available anytime to meet with people individually here at Duke if they're working on an NSF grant and would like consultation, would like some support, would like an extra set of eyes to take a look at their proposals before they submit them and give them feedback on their broader impact section. Or, maybe you're not quite there yet, you don't even know where to start. I regularly have meetings one-on-one with people at Duke, from grad students all the way up through senior faculty, to brainstorm and talk about ideas for broader impacts. Just a little bit more on my background so you know where I'm coming from. My training is actually in the biomedical sciences. My PhD is in immunology, but starting as a postdoc, my whole career has focused on science outreach and science communication. That's what I've been doing really ever since grad school. And as someone who was doing outreach in the trenches, going out into schools and into museums and community centers for 20 years and doing science outreach, I sort of fell into doing broader impacts work. My colleagues here at Duke and at other places would increasingly ask me if I could help them with the broader impacts of their proposals. And that just sort of turned into this gig as working with ARIS and running the Broader Impacts Resource Center. So the main thing I do at Duke besides that is teaching science communication courses. And I see the two as very complementary, because ultimately I really view broader impacts as a process of communicating the relevance of your research to broader audiences. So that's a little background on me. My email address is right there, jory@duke.edu, and I encourage you all to contact me anytime if you have questions about broader impacts. All right, I'm going to try to get through a lot of information quickly, but I want to encourage you, if you have questions, put them in chat or virtually raise your hand. I will try to keep an eye on both of those things. And I'll try to get to questions. I'll also try to leave some time at the end for open Q&A. Objectives for today's session. Well, I just want to start by giving all of you a better understanding and perspective of what the broader impacts criterion is, what the NSF is looking for, and how to develop and implement broader impacts activities. Another important element of BI is assessing broader impacts activities. Once you've developed them and implemented them, how do you evaluate or assess them? Unfortunately, we just don't have time to get into that topic today because it's a huge one. I'll touch on it briefly, but I do separate workshops just on evaluating broader impacts, and would be happy to talk with any of you in the future about possibly scheduling another workshop just on evaluation of broader impacts. But today we're going to just sort of take the 30,000 foot view. How do you develop BI activities? How do you implement them? How do you form partnerships to make them function effectively? And then we're going to focus a bit on the resources that are available here at Duke and in the surrounding community to help you do broader impacts work. And then my more lofty sort of pie in the sky objective for today is to really at least start the process of transforming the way all of you might be thinking about broader impacts. And what I mean by this is, you know, if you've been around for a while and writing NSF grants for a while, you probably remember a time when broader impacts was really thought of as just sort of a burden, right? People just wanted to do their research. And now all of a sudden, you know, starting about 23 years ago or so, when the NSF finalized its two criteria or simplified its two criteria to the ones we'll talk about in a second, one of them being broader impacts, you know, people said, well, I just want to do my research, and now they're telling me I have to do outreach as well, even though I'm not an outreach person, and what a pain in the butt, right? And that was sort of historically how it came along. And, you know, over time, I think people have been starting to be a little more open to it. But I think for a lot of people, it's still viewed as kind of a box checking activity. You know, I'll just sort of say and do the bare minimum in my broader impact section, knowing that the review panelists are really going to be focusing on my intellectual merit, on my research, because that's what really matters. But if I just check the right boxes, hopefully that's enough to get me my grant. And what we really try to do in ERIS, and what I try to do with the BERC, the Broader Impacts Resource Center, is to move people towards that other end of the spectrum where you can start to really view broader impacts as an opportunity to impact your community in really meaningful ways, an opportunity to hopefully have a lot of fun and enjoy the process of engaging with the public around your work, but also an opportunity to have your broader impacts work feed back on and inform your research. And so your research will not only make your broader impacts work better, but ideally your broader impacts work will allow you to do better research as well. So that's really sort of our lofty goal in ERIS and with the Broader Impacts Resource Center, or BERC. All right, so we'll start at the beginning, and I'm sure probably everyone here already knows this, but what is the BI, or Broader Impacts Criterion? Well, every single proposal at the NSF, whether it's a GRFP for grad students all the way up to the multi-year center grants and, you know, the STC grants and the big massive 5-year grants, millions of dollars, every single one of those proposals in that spectrum are evaluated on the same two criteria. The first one is intellectual merit, or sometimes abbreviated IM. And this is essentially the research that you're proposing, right? What is the research that you're proposing to do? How well do you lay it out in your proposal? Will it push forward our understanding within our discipline and across disciplines? And when most people think of the core, the content of a research proposal, this is what they're thinking of, is what research are you proposing to do, and how are you going to do it, and why does it matter? That's the intellectual merit. The other criteria that the NSF has is the broader impacts criterion, or BI criterion. And this, according to the NSF, according to their parlance, is the potential for the project to benefit society or advance desired societal outcomes. Now, in practical terms, people typically, when they think about broader impacts, view it as a couple different things. They either think of it as some sort of outreach, going to a local school to talk about your research, or doing a pub talk or a science cafe, or maybe a session at a museum. Or often people think broader impacts is contributing or trying to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM disciplines. And those are definitely two of the main ways that people have successfully addressed the BI criterion in the past. But as we'll see in a minute, according to the NSF, there are really other ways to do it as well. So it doesn't have to be visiting a local high school or bringing underrepresented students into your lab for a summer research program. Those are great things to do, and I encourage people to do those if those are the types of things that would be valuable and rewarding for you. But those aren't the only ways to address the BI criterion. But it's those two criteria that are the ones upon which all NSF proposals are evaluated. Now, by the way, I prepared a sort of a one-pager, which is a PDF, which anybody who's interested can download it. And I'm going to ask my colleague Tim to put a link to that in the chat room right now. And it has links to many of the resources I'm going to be talking about throughout the session today. Thank you, Tim. All right, so another comment about broader impacts within the NSF. As of right now, and historically, this is how it's always been, the NSF is the only federal funding agency that has an explicit broader impacts criterion, right? Other funding agencies like the NIH or DOE, from time to time in their RFPs, their requests for proposal, they may say something like, address the significance or the implications of your work or the relevance of your work. But that's not a universal thing that's across every single RFP within that funding agency. For now, the NSF is the only federal funding agency that has this explicit broader impacts criterion that's present for every single proposal. And I actually think that if you sort of do a little digging into why that is, it can give you some really valuable perspective in how to approach the broader impacts criterion in your own grant writing. Okay, so the NIH, we all know, supports biomedical research, right? And I always like to joke that no taxpayer has ever called up their congressperson and said, how dare you use my tax dollars to cure cancer, right? My point here is that people, the general public, even if they're not trained as scientists or engineers, generally understand and accept the value of and the importance of biomedical research. And so when the NIH spends millions and millions of dollars to do things like, help develop new vaccines in the middle of a pandemic, of course, it's intuitively obvious to the public why that's important, why that's a valuable thing. Now, the NSF, as you all know, supports a different type of research, right? They don't typically support biomedical research. They support what a lot of people refer to as basic research. I tend to not like the term basic research because I think it can be seen as pejorative. I think a better way to refer to NSF-funded research, or at least how I do it, is I call it foundational research, because it is the foundation upon which all of the other research, the clinical research and the biomedical research is built, right? We wouldn't have new vaccines if we didn't understand how mRNA works. So the basic or the foundational science is essential to the kinds of science that people inherently understand the value of. But people don't always appreciate the importance of foundational research. And so what the NSF is essentially saying to every researcher who applies for an NSF grant is, if you want us to give you taxpayer money to do your research, then you can't just come up with a plan to do the good research. That's not enough. You also need to have a plan for helping those taxpayers understand how they benefit from the work that you're doing and why it matters, right? So it's sort of an accountability thing. And I think if you view the broader impacts criterion through that lens, that gives you a better sense of how to address it or how to approach it or how to frame your broader impacts work. So you really want to frame it as, here's how I'm going to help people understand what my work is all about and why it matters to them. And a lot of that feeds back to where I come from when I teach science communication, which is helping the public understand what you do and why it matters. So, for now, the NSF is the only funding agency that has this broader impacts criterion. Within ERIS, we spend a lot of time talking to folks, not just at the NSF, but NIH and DoD and DOE. And we've been hearing more and more over the last couple of years that a lot of these other agencies are sort of looking towards implementing some across the board criterion. Whether they call it broader impacts or not remains to be seen. But I don't have a crystal ball, but I think in 5 or 10 years, we may see a lot of these other agencies have sort of a standard requirement like this for all proposals. But as of right now, it's just the NSF. All right, any questions? You can throw them in chat. You can virtually raise your hand. Okay, I'm going to keep moving then, but again, feel free to use chat or do a virtual hand raise if you want. So let me give you some examples. What does broader impacts look like? I mentioned that it can often look like visiting a high school classroom or doing a science cafe or doing some diversity work, right? So here are some examples of that. So example number one, as a scientist or an engineer, you go into a classroom, high school classroom, third grade classroom, after school program, summer science camp, wherever it is, and you spend some time talking to students about what it is that you do and helping them understand the relevance of your work, okay? The inverse of that is maybe as a scientist or an engineer or even a social scientist, you invite members of the public, students, or the general public into your research environment, whether it's a lab or you take them out into the field with you, and you give them exposure to your life and what it's like as a researcher. Introduce them to your grad students and your postdocs and have them develop a better appreciation for what science is and how it's done, right? But it can also be things like curriculum development or changing the way we teach STEM disciplines. So developing new curriculum for homeschoolers, for example, which has been very relevant over the past year with the pandemic, right? Or developing new pedagogical approaches within your own classes, maybe experimenting with new ways to teach chemistry or teach engineering that are more engaging and hopefully lead to better learning outcomes. Those can be broader impacts activities as well. And then there's the diversity initiatives, the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, which are referred to by the NSF as broadening participation efforts. So anything that broadens the participation of groups that are currently underrepresented in STEM disciplines is a very valid approach and one that the NSF supports to a great extent. And just to be clear, when I talk about groups underrepresented in STEM, people often think it's women in science and engineering or ethnic minorities that are underrepresented, and it certainly is. But there are other groups, other demographics that are dramatically underrepresented in STEM. So it could be first generation college students or people from low income families. It could be veterans. It could be people with physical disabilities. It could be members of the LGBTQ community. So any group that is sort of marginalized and underrepresented in STEM represents a group that could be potentially a really good group to work with in your broader impacts activities. Additionally, it's things like citizen science. So actually getting members of the public to go out into the world and collect data, make observations, do bird counts or some other sort of census data, and then contribute their counts to your research. So that's called citizen science. And it's a great way to do broader impacts because the NSF really likes it because it's sort of double dipping, right? You're getting the public engaged, you're doing broader impacts, but you're also collecting more data that way. And so it's supporting your intellectual merit work as well. Increasingly, the NSF is also really pushing and promoting what they call workforce development, which is programs, whether it's for high school students or community colleges and vocational schools, or even at four-year colleges and universities that are geared towards training and preparing and enhancing the STEM workforce, where numbers have been dwindling. And so there's an effort to really increase the number of people who are in the STEM workforce. And finally, one more sort of extreme example. I don't know if there's any physicists in the group today, but if there are, you may recognize this. This is the superconducting super collider. I hope I said that right. I'm not a physicist, but it's basically a giant atom smasher. I think this is the one in CERN, which I think is in Switzerland. Why am I showing this in the talk about broader impacts? Well, it turns out that developing new research or enhancing research infrastructure is also a way to address the broader impacts criterion. So developing a new facility, a facility that you would use for research, but potentially you could also use for educational purposes, is a way to address the broader impacts criterion. Now, I don't expect most people to build an atom smasher as their broader impacts activity. This is kind of an extreme example. I just think it's a really cool picture, actually. But I think you get the idea, right? Anything that enhances research infrastructure can also be a way to address the broader impacts criterion. So the point of this slide is that I really want you all to start getting away from thinking, visit a high school classroom or host underrepresented students in my lab in the summer as the only ways to address broader impacts, because there are lots and lots of ways to do it. Geneva, okay, so Switzerland, so I was right. So I'm not going to get distracted, but I bet there's really interesting stuff about that there. Stefan, thank you for sharing that, and I hope I got the details right. I probably mangled it because I'm a biologist, not a physicist, but all right. So moving on, why do broader impacts matter? Well, I'll start with the very cynical answer. The cynical answer is that, in case you didn't know, it's kind of hard to get NSF grants. It's fairly competitive, right? This is not breaking news. It's not quite like finding the proverbial needle in a haystack, but getting an NSF grant is a tough thing to do. Currently, across all the directorates in the NSF, the funding rates of between 20 and 25%. Fluctuates from time to time, but it's about, roughly 1 in 4 grants get funded. That may not sound that bad, but within certain directorates and even certain divisions, it's actually much, much lower, right? I know certain divisions within the biology directorate where the funding rates are as low as 4 or 5%, right? It is very hard to get NSF grants. It is very competitive. And what we're starting to see more and more, and when I say we, I mean as a member of ERIS, of the ERIS community, but also as someone who has served on a number of NSF review panels over the years, we're starting to really see that broader impacts can be the difference maker, right? So if you're on a panel, you get 45 proposals, 40 of them are going to have outstanding intellectual merit. I mean, maybe that's slightly high, but it's not unusual to have a lot of really strong grants with a lot of really strong intellectual merit components to them. But you can only fund 12 or 13 of those, right? So how do you make those decisions? The panel doesn't make the decisions, of course, the program officers do, but they do it based on the panel's recommendations. And the panels will look at the intellectual merit, but they'll also look at the broader impacts. And if the broader impacts has been done well, that can be a difference maker. I've seen it happen every time I've done an NSF review panel. I've seen certain proposals get pushed over the top because they had really strong broader impacts as well as intellectual merit. Now, what I've never seen is a proposal that had lousy intellectual merit, but the broader impacts were so cool that they decided to fund it anyway. I don't know that that's ever happened. I don't know that that ever will happen. The point is your intellectual merit always has to be rock solid. But beyond that, just having good IM is not enough. And the strong broader impacts piece can really be the difference maker and push you over the top. So from a cynical perspective, it's about dollars and cents. That's why broader impacts matter. But I want to give you my more idealistic answer. I'm not 100% cynical. I still have a glimmer of idealism from time to time. And one of the things, there are several things that I think are sort of more big picture things in terms of why broader impacts matters. One is that broader impacts, as I was saying earlier, is sort of an accountability, right? It's sort of how are we using taxpayer money to do our research? And I don't ever think that accountability with other people's money and other people's trust is a bad thing. So I think asking people to do that is reasonable and important. It forces you as a researcher to think more deeply about the relevance of your work, the implications of your work, why you're doing it, and why it matters. it reinforces, this comes back to my gig as a teaching science communication, it reinforces and strengthens communication skills in scientists and engineers, which I think it's obviously so important for people in STEM to be able to communicate what they do effectively. And so this reinforces that. But the final 2 points are the ones that I really am the most passionate about and think are the most important reasons. And one of those is that this is where we get our next generation of scientists and engineers, right? By doing things to engage the public and excite the public. This is where kids get inspired to travel to Mars one day, or to build an atom smasher in their garden shed, or whatever it is that's getting them excited about STEM, right? So this is how we do it. Part of our responsibility, I think, as members of the STEM community is to share our passion and our enthusiasm to excite the next generation of scientists and engineers. And finally, and I think personally, most importantly, is this has been shown to be the best and most influential way to increase diversity in STEM. And I've been working in STEM diversity my whole career, and I could go on all day about why it's important to have more diversity. Hopefully I don't need to, and you're all on board with that concept, but broader impacts is really how we do that, right? It's the way to increase diversity in STEM. Okay, are there questions? I see a couple comments, no questions, I don't think. So I'm gonna move on. All right, where do broader impacts fit in your proposal? If I'm looking at your NSF grant, where should I see broader impacts discussed? Just out of curiosity, maybe if you're willing, type it into chat, some thoughts on where you might want to see or expect to see broader impacts appearing in your proposal. Anyone have any thoughts on that? What sections are going to mention broader impacts? Okay, so one comment. I love it when they're integrated throughout. Pretty much gave away the punchline, but that's okay. Yeah, so I don't see any other comments, but you're all being shy, which you shouldn't be, but really, they should be everywhere. Anywhere that it's relevant, it should appear in your proposal, right? So obviously it needs to be in the one-page project summary, which is, the paragraph that's an abstract. Tim, yes, is there a question?
I think that the answer is that they're supposed to be everywhere.
Oh, thank you, Tim.
Throughout.
Thank you, Tim, for that contribution. Yes, so, the one-page project summary where you have a paragraph that's an abstract of your proposal, and then a section labeled intellectual merit, and a separate section labeled broader impacts. And if you don't have that separate label for broader impacts, they'll actually toss out the whole proposal. Clearly in the project description, the main narrative of the grant, which is typically sort of most grants, it's a 15-page section. It should be discussed throughout that. But anywhere else it's relevant. So for example, if you're going to be funding postdocs, or you're going to have postdocs engaged in your research or in your broader impacts, then it should be discussed in your postdoc mentoring plan. If your broader impacts are going to be resulting in generation of data, which they should, and we'll talk about evaluation briefly in a little bit, if you're going to be collecting data about your broader impacts activities, you should mention it in your data management plan. Certainly, you should think about having the appropriate partners to help you do your broader impacts. And so that should be in the letters of collaboration. If it's going to cost you anything to do broader impacts, then it should appear in your budget. And there's a question, aren't letters of collaboration now generic, and therefore BI cannot be discussed in letters of collaboration? That's absolutely right. And what I mean by that is that historically, what people would often do to get around the 15-page limit is they would write, a 5-page letter of support for one of their partners, and they would give it to them and say, put it on your letterhead and sign it. And it would be a way of sort of cheating and getting a bunch of extra information in the letter of support about what was going to be done. And so you'd get a 15-page proposal with 25 pages of letters of support, and it just kind of got out of hand. So what the NSF did several years ago was say, moving forward, letters of collaboration have to be just a single sentence, a boilerplate thing, which says, if this grant is awarded, I will collaborate in the ways described by the PI in the proposal. And that was a way of shifting the burden back to the grant writer to make you have to fit everything into your 15 pages rather than just, spilling it into a 5-page letter of support. So Nicholas, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't mean to be unclear about that. I didn't mean that the letters themselves should describe the broader impacts. What I meant was that if you're going to have partners, then you should have letters of support and letters of collaboration from those broader impact partners as well. But thank you for that point, because it allowed me to clarify that. And so the point is that anywhere broader impacts is relevant to your proposal, which ideally should be everywhere, it should appear in your proposal. And this is a quote that we always show because we think it really summarizes this very concisely, which is, it's a quote from an NSF PO, program officer, who said, "The best broader impacts plans are ones which are seamlessly integrated into the research." And historically, what you would often see would be a 15-page grant would have 14 and a half pages all about the intellectual merit. And then at the very end, on the last page, there'd be one paragraph thrown in that would say, broader impacts. If I get funded, I'll go visit a local high school and tell them what I do. Box checked, I'm done, right? And that is not seamless integration. That's very much someone just paying lip service and putting in a paragraph at the end. And what we now want to see is that we want to see more discussion about how the intellectual merit and the broader impacts interact with each other, and that can be discussed throughout. But even at the very least, you can't get away with a paragraph at the end anymore. Typically now what we're seeing is 2 pages, 2.5 pages, broader impacts, right? I mean, in an ideal world, as someone who spends all my time thinking about broader impacts, I'd love it to be 7.5 pages of intellectual merit and 7.5 pages of broader impacts. That's never going to happen. But if you can at least have 2 or 3 pages, it shows that you're really thinking deeply and you're presenting a comprehensive broader impacts plan. The other thing is, the way people tend to write grants, and I've seen this over and over, is you may start 3-4 months early, but you may spend the first 2.5 or 3 months only thinking about the intellectual merit. And it's not till the very end often that people start thinking about broader impacts. And this has happened to me more times than I can count, where I get an email from someone and they say, "I'm working on an NSF grant. It's due in 3 days. I have to write the broader impacts. Can you help me?" And my response is, I'll help you as much as I can, but there's really a limited amount that I can do on such short notice. And the earlier you come to me for help with your broader impacts, the better I can do at my job of helping you with that. And what I tell people is, the day that you sit down to start thinking about your intellectual merit, whether that's 3 months out or 6 months out or whatever, you should also be thinking about broader impacts on that day. And do not wait until the last minute to do it. The question is, are you saying to have letters from, for example, high schools, if that's one of the proposed activities? Absolutely, right? The nice thing about having sort of a boilerplate letter now is that there is almost no burden on the partner to produce that letter. You just send them the letter, ask them to put it on their letterhead, sign it, send it back to you. So it's not a big deal for them. But if you're going to be talking about a broader impacts plan and broader impacts activities that involve a partnership with a local high school or the local school district or the local museum or a local summer science camp, then you absolutely should have a letter of support showing that you've already had those conversations with them. And if you get the funding, you're going to be able to hit the ground running. What the NSF does not want to see is you get the 3-year grant funded, and at that point, you start going out into your community and searching for a school where you can do your broader impacts. Because you're going to lose 6 months of your 3 years of funding just trying to find those partnerships. So by starting early and lining those partnerships up in advance, and then getting that letter and including it in your proposal, you are sending a clear message to the review panel that you've done your homework, you've done your due diligence, you have a partner identified, and they're ready to hit the ground running with you. Thank you for that question. Great question. All right. This is the part where usually people start getting a little antsy and say, okay, give me a specific example. I want to see a really cool broader impacts activity. And it just so happens that I have an example here for you. This is my favorite example. I think this is one of the coolest broader impacts projects or activities ever. And full disclosure, it happens to be a friend of mine and a colleague of mine. Her name is Nalini Nadkarni. She is a professor at University of Utah. And as you might guess from the picture, she's a canopy ecologist. She's happiest when she's up in the treetops, but she also does amazing broader impacts work on the ground. And I always tend to go on too long about Nalini because I just love her work so much. So I'm going to try to be really quick, quicker than I ever am. But if you want to hear more about Nalini, we'll have a Zoom session and I'll spend hours telling you how amazing she is. But Nalini, one of her projects was she was concerned about moss populations that were being decimated in the forests of the Pacific. And yes, she has been on Wait, Don't Tell Me, which makes her even cooler. She was concerned about moss populations dwindling in the Pacific Northwest forest because the floral industry was actually going out into the woods and pulling all these mosses. And I'm not a moss guy. I don't know a lot about mosses, but I've learned a bit from Nalini. But apparently they're very slow to grow back. And so it was really damaging the forest. And so as one of Nalini's research projects, her intellectual merit, she was experimenting with different ways to grow mosses essentially in vitro in a greenhouse and then repopulate them into the forest. And these are just a couple different ways she was doing it. One involved putting them in these mesh bags and hanging them in a greenhouse. And then the other one was putting them on these stacking plastic trays. This is the top picture there is looking down from above. So she had these ideas for ways to do this. What she didn't have was the manpower, the person power to do this. And so she had this kind of moment of inspiration where she reached out to a local prison and she proposed to them that she would like to start a program where she would come in and she would teach the incarcerated individuals, teach them science, teach them biology, teach them about plants and about mosses. And it would be, educational for them. And then she would actually build a greenhouse within the walls of the prison and teach them hands-on how to do this work. And of course, I want to point out, the plan was never, forced labor, right? This was purely voluntary. It was anyone in the prison who wanted to be involved. It was a privilege to them to be able to do this. It wasn't forced on them in any way. But what she found was that the guys there were starving for some intellectual stimulation and something to do with their hands and something that felt like to them like they were making a difference. And you can see there's a picture here where she had given one of the incarcerated individuals a book to identify different mosses, and he was starting to really work with them and experiment with them. And the project was really successful. They were able to start growing mosses in greenhouses and repopulating them back into the forests. And she was seeing some really great results. And it quickly expanded into a bunch of other related conservation biology projects involving fish and invasive weeds and birds of prey that were endangered and all of these other projects. And it kept expanding because there was such a powerful workforce of scientists within the prison who wanted to do this work, were intellectually starved for something to do, and did a really great job with it. And beyond just doing these research projects, it even expanded into, some of the guys in the prison said, well, we don't really want to take the classes and do the work, but maybe just some short lectures, just come give talks about science. And so she started a lecture series, and then when she didn't do it, her grad students and her postdocs did it, and faculty colleagues started doing it. And then it expanded into women's prisons. And she even started a project working with people in solitary confinement who spend 23 hours a day in a teeny cell by themselves. And her project involved, for 1 hour a day, projecting nature imagery on the walls of their cell, which seems like a almost trivial thing. But when your alternative is 23 hours a day staring at a cinder block wall, that 1 hour a day of nature films and nature imagery really made a difference. In fact, she got some data that suggested that people who viewed these nature videos were significantly less likely to show violent infractions than people who didn't see them. Similarly, she started getting feedback that people who were involved in her program who viewed it as a privilege and didn't want to lose that privilege, showed dramatic decreases in violent behavior and misbehaviors in the prisons. She's gotten some anecdotal reports of decreased recidivism in people that have worked with her and then been released and show a lower inclination to repeat crimes and end up back in prison. And the most amazing story, which I tell every time and I still get chills, and I've told the story 1,000 times, is she started working with one guy who had never even finished high school when he went to prison. While he started working with her, he got his high school equivalency degree. He eventually was released from prison and went to a local community college and got an associate's degree in biology, decided that was not enough for him, went on and got a 4-year degree in biology, loved it, decided he wanted to keep going, and recently finished and got a PhD in plant biology and is now working, collaborating with Nalini on some of these projects. I mean, talk about transforming a life, right? And again, I want to emphasize that when Nalini started this, it was very modest. It was, I need some extra hands to help me grow moss, right? It was a broader impacts activity that grew out of her intellectual merit. And it just was such a brilliant idea. I mean, Nalini's the first to say she never in a million years imagined it would snowball the way it did and become so successful, right? And not every broader impacts activity will be this successful, but it just goes to show that if you are filling a need or a niche within your intellectual merit work, it can sometimes lead to really amazing things. And if we had time, I'd sort of put you in groups and have you brainstorm on what are the great elements of her project. We don't have time for that, so I'll just put up this bullet point list and say to all of you, this does so many things well when it comes to broader impacts. It's serving an extremely underserved population. It has educational impacts. It has research impacts. It has environmental impacts because it's conservation biology work. It has these amazing humanitarian and social justice components. She's gotten her grad students and postdocs and colleagues involved. And so it's now great professional development opportunities for all of them. It was novel. Nobody had done this before her. Now, you don't have to come up with something this novel every time, but it certainly doesn't hurt. But you can also do iterative things where you build on something that already exists, but you push it in a new direction. And that's okay too. But the novelty of a brilliant idea never hurts. Excuse me. It leverages existing resources. So the grants build on themselves. It's replicable and scalable. So it started out small at one prison, and then she expanded it to multiple prisons. And now other people around the country are contacting her and getting her advice so that they can start programs similar to this one where they are. Funding, she's gotten, contacted emails out of the blue from foundations who said, we saw your work in the New York Times or on PBS, and we think it's so great. Can we give you $1 million to do your broader impacts work? So, who's going to complain if a foundation contacts you out of the blue and asks if they can give you $1 million? Last, this is a little cynical, but don't underestimate the value of, University of Utah gets a lot of mileage out of saying, look at our amazing professor and all the wonderful work she's doing, right? So, there's just lots and lots of fantastic things about Nalini's work. And so, again, I don't expect everyone to hit a grand slam like that first time out up to the plate, but this just gives you an idea how something very small and modest can really evolve and grow into something amazing. If you want a few more examples, actually a lot more examples, you can, I encourage you, take a screen grab of this. I think I also, in the resources page, which Tim, if you want to put that resource link there in the chat room again, I think I have links to both of these. But these are just two different websites. One is from Georgia Tech's sponsored programs office, where they just list a bunch of NSF grants from Georgia Tech that have been funded, and the title of the grant, how much money the grant received, and then the 1-paragraph summary of the broader impacts activity. And so you can just scroll down and see, example after example of the kinds of broader impacts activities that are written into funded proposals. And then similarly, the one on the left, COSI, is formerly was an NSF funded center. It's Center for Ocean Science Education Excellence. And they've got a long list of case studies of fantastic broader impacts activities. So these are good places for you to get other ideas and other inspiration for types of broader impacts that you could do. Okay, now I'm going really quickly, but if people have questions, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, and you're also encouraged to raise your hand virtually if you have a question. Maybe I'll just pause there, take a sip of water, and if anybody does have a question, feel free to unmute and ask the question. Okay, well then let's move on to the nuts and bolts, creating a broader impacts plan. This is taken straight from the NSF website, and I generally don't like all text bullet point slides, so I'm not going to make you read this. I'm certainly not going to read it to you. All I'm going to tell you about this is straight from the NSF, and I did my best to sort of distill it down in the next slide. But essentially, they're saying for broader impacts, you have to have a clear idea presented, what you're going to do. You have to have a justification, an explanation for why you're doing that, who you're serving, who's going to do the work, what the work is going to be, what resources you're going to need, and what plan you have in place to demonstrate that it was effective. And the reason I show this slide, even though it's an ugly all text bullet point slide, is because if any of this sounds familiar, this is pretty much what you do all the time for your intellectual merit, right? So what the NSF is saying is take the same approach to your broader impacts that you always take with your intellectual merit. And again, I kind of tried to make it a little more concise here and present a series of questions. Your section for broader impacts should address, what are you going to do? What's your justification or rationale for doing that? Why do you want to do it? How are you going to do it? What are the resources you're going to need? Who's going to actually do the work? Who's going to help? And then that evaluation piece. How are you going to demonstrate that you've had the impact that you're saying you've had, or that you think you're going to have? Now, to piece this out a little bit more, when I say, what do you want to do and why do you want to do it? People often ask me, well, is it better to work with high school kids, or is it better to do some sort of diversity, minority outreach thing? Or what does the NSF like best, right? What's going to have the highest odds of getting me funded? And my answer is that there is no best, right? We all wish there was that sort of secret magic bullet. But what's really important is that whatever you choose to do, and whatever sort of event you choose to plan or activity you choose to plan, and whatever audience you are choosing to work with, you just need to have a rationale for why you are choosing to do that set of activities with that audience. So for example, maybe you were a first-generation college student yourself, and for you, it's really important to feel like you can make a difference and you can be the inspiration for the next generation of next-gen college students, right? Maybe that's where you want to have your impact. And so discuss that in your proposal. Say, for my broader impacts, I'm choosing to, develop this program where I'm going to go out to local schools with high minority populations, and I'm going to identify at-risk kids, and I'm going to develop a program to get them excited about STEM. And it's going to be a 3-step process where I talk to them in their classrooms, and then I do a weekend excursion where we do a nature walk and learn about nature. And then some of them will be invited into my lab the next summer to do a summer research with me. And my goal is to be that person who makes a difference in their life as first-gen students, because I had that person in my life and it made a big difference, right? That's a very compelling story. And in my science communication class, I always talk about the importance of storytelling and how powerful storytelling can be. So think of your narrative of your broader impacts as an opportunity to tell the story of what you want to do and why you want to do it and why it's necessary, right? And then all that other stuff that goes along with it, the details, the plan of implementing it, and the partners you're going to use and the resources you'll need, and all of that should be in there as well. But that narrative is a really important piece. So I want to make sure that you think about including that. Now I'm showing you this document here. This is a document that we produced in ERIS. Actually, before we were called ERIS, our previous iteration was called NABI, which was National Alliance for Broader Impacts. And we produced this document. It's called Broader Impacts Guiding Principles. I always keep a copy of it on my desk, and everyone who came to visit me in my office in the before times before I was working at home, if they came to talk to me about broader impacts, they got a copy of this. and it's just sort of a pamphlet. You open it up, it's just a few pages, right? But it's all of those questions that I showed you on the previous slide. It walks you through them step by step. And I always hand this to people and say, this is your answer key. In fact, we gave thousands of copies of this to the NSF, and they hand them out to people who are doing serving on review panels as sort of a guiding document to help them evaluate the broader impacts section of their proposals. And so when I give this to people at Duke, I say, here's the answer key, right? This is what your review panelists, these are the questions they'll be asking themselves about your proposal when they're reviewing it. So I say, tape it over your computer and just keep it in front of you the whole time you're writing the grant, and keep asking yourself, am I addressing those questions, right? And in that document, which by the way, is it's free to download as a PDF, and it's included on the list of resources that Tim has linked in the chat room. So if you download that PDF document, there's a link to the guiding principles. And it includes this list, which again, ugly bullet point list. It just says all the ways you might address broader impacts, but a prettier way to present that is to refer back to the slide I showed you earlier. So, by addressing one of these things, or maybe a couple of these things, those are the ways that you should be thinking about addressing broader impacts. Now, I want to make a really important point here, which is, and I hope no one heard me say or thought they heard me say that you have to address all of these things in your broader impacts, right? One of the easiest ways to ding a proposal when you're on a review panel is to say it's overly ambitious. And that applies both to the intellectual merit and to the broader impacts. So if you say you're going to visit, school classrooms, and you're going to invite students to your lab, and you're going to create a new curriculum, and you're going to run a diversity program, and you're going to do workforce development, and you're going to build an atom smasher, all in 1 3-year grant, you're probably being probably is the wrong word. You're absolutely being overly ambitious. So find one or two things that make sense for you, and that's what you focus on. And don't give reviewers the low-hanging fruit to ding your proposal for being overly ambitious. And if you are struggling with the idea of, well, how much is appropriate and ambitious without being overly ambitious, this is where, meeting with me before you submit your proposal, I can read through it with you and we can talk about it, and I can give you some sense from both having done this kind of work for a long time and having been on a bunch of NSF panels of whether it's probably overly ambitious or not. Okay, I want to make a few more points, and then in actually a few minutes, I've invited one of my colleagues who does outreach activities and education activities at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham. I've invited him to join us, and so he's going to be here to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about working with him in their museum. But first, I want to just give you a few more tips. One of them I sort of touched on already, which is find the right fit for you, right? So if someone comes into my office and they say, I'm working on an NSF grant, I know that for the broader impacts, I'm supposed to go into schools and visit kids, but I really hate kids. So do I have to do that? If I get a comment like that, and I've actually gotten comments similar to that before, my first response is, no, please. If you hate kids, the last thing I want you to do is write into your broader impacts that you're going to go into a classroom and hang out with kids, right? It won't be good for the kids. It won't be good for you. It won't end well for anyone, right? But what is it you do like to do, right? Well, I don't mind the teachers so much. Well, okay, then maybe work on some activities to professional development activities for the teachers to help them teach your discipline more effectively. Or maybe you just don't like being in, K-12 schools in general. Well, then, I might direct you to think about some sort of summer science camp or a partnership with a local museum, or you can work, it doesn't always have to be kids. It can be retired people and senior citizens. There's lots of ways to engage them, or, work with other marginalized populations. So you need to find the fit that's a good fit for who you are as a person and what you're going to enjoy doing. If you put yourself in a situation where you don't want to be there and you hate working with that group of people, like I said, it won't end well for anyone. So do some introspection and think about, what do I like to do? What do I do when I'm not, in my spare time, when I'm not doing my research, which I know is a joke because nobody has spare time, but, the things that you do outside of, if there is that time outside of your lab. I've talked to people who said, well, the one thing that I make time to do outside of my research and running my lab is I'm a scout leader for my daughter's scout troop, and I really love doing that. Okay, so then we've developed broader impacts activities around teaching scout groups about science or engineering, right? And then, it not only helps those 12 girls in your Girl Scout troop, but it also can be, put on your website and shared through Girl Scout community discussion boards, so that Girl Scout troops all over the country can start doing these activities, just like you did with yours, right? And so that becomes a very large scale and hopefully effective broader impacts activity. So find the right fit for who you are as a person. That makes a big difference. And in ERIS, we talk a lot about this idea of finding or identifying your broader impacts identity, or BI identity. And that really gets to the point I was just making, right? Almost any researcher is going to be comfortable with the idea of what is their research identity, right? Your research identity is who you are as a researcher. It determines who you choose to collaborate with, and what grants you write, and what journals you try to publish in, and what conferences you go to. And as researchers, we're always thinking about our research identity, and we're always sort of thinking long term, what is our legacy going to be in our field? What's the difference we're going to make in our discipline? How are we going to change the world with our research, right? Researchers are pretty comfortable thinking about that for their research. Rarely do they have the same kind of thought process for their broader impacts work. And there's no reason why that should be the case, right? There's no reason why you can't, as a young researcher now, start thinking about not only how you want to change the world through your research, but how you want to change the world through your broader impacts work, right? You wouldn't write a 3-year grant to the NSF, propose a bunch of research, and then at the end of that, write the next grant where you start research from scratch. You start a whole new research project, right? That's not how you do it. It's iterative. You build on your research successes to start really building and growing your research legacy or research identity. So do the same thing with your broader impacts, right? A lot of people treat broader impacts as a 3 and done. I'll do these activities for this grant, and then for the next grant, I'll just come up with some new stuff. And there's no reason, right? It's the same as with your intellectual merit. Build on your past successes. Think about what you want your identity as an impact person to be, and then build towards that. And I often frame it as, at your retirement banquet, whether it's 10 years from now or 30 years from now, what do you want them to stand up there and say about how you change the world, not just through your research, but through your impacts work? How did you make your community a better place by doing the work that you did? And so all of that comes back to finding the right fit for who you are and bringing your identity into your broader impacts work. And again, I do whole workshops on helping people sort of draft a broader impacts identity statement so that they can start building their legacy. And I know we have some grad students on this call and probably a lot of postdocs. Now's the time that you should be thinking about your BI identity, right? Don't wait until you're working on your first career award or your career award or beyond that, right? Start thinking about it now. Okay, a couple other points I want to make really quickly. In addition to finding the right fit, you want to find the right partner. Find, that community partner or that institutional partner who's going to help you do what you want to do more effectively. But it has to be a true partnership as well. So it shouldn't be one-sided, right? A true partnership is one where you and the other people benefit. So for example, a lot of people say, for my broader impacts, I'm going to go, develop a display for a museum, and I'm going to go do some talks at a museum, and I'll just get the folks at the museum to help me put all that together. But then they won't write in any money in their budget to compensate the museum educators for the time it takes them to do that work, right? So that's a one-sided partnership because you're benefiting, you're getting this venue and the expertise of these museum educators, but what are they getting from that, right? I mean, you need to take into account their time and be a good partner and be respectful of that. So, you make sure you write in $5,000 in your proposal to compensate them for, the 80 hours they're going to spend working with you. Or I just made those numbers up. I don't know if it adds up, but you get the idea, right? So find the right partner. I've had people come to me and say, for my broader impacts, I think it would be really cool to create a summer science camp. And my response is usually, well, summer science camps are great, but we already have like 8 of them in Durham, right? So rather than creating number 9, which would mean you'd have to start from scratch and you'd have to deal with all of the logistics and the, the insurance concerns and the creating a website for it and doing all of these things, how about if you just find a summer science camp that doesn't currently offer anything within your area of expertise, and then you can partner with them and you can develop some cool activities and do them at that summer science camp. And then you benefit because you're leveraging their existing infrastructure, and they benefit because they're getting some science brought to them that they don't currently have. So that's what I mean by finding the right partner. The next thing is to be programmatic. So what the NSF doesn't want to see is they don't want to see just a laundry list of, I'm going to give a talk at a high school, and then I'm going to do a pub talk or a science cafe talk, and then I'm going to make a website to explain nanotechnology, just kind of a laundry list of 3 semi-disconnected things. What they want to see is something where everything builds on everything else, everything sort of complements everything else, and you're telling a story. And I'll just refer you back to what I told you about Nalini and her work as a perfect example of a programmatic broader impacts approach, where ideas are building on previous ideas and everything's complementing everything else, and you're adding additional layers, and it becomes very robust, but it's all connected. That's a much stronger broader impacts proposal than one where you're just doing the laundry list of different things. I always get asked about budgeting. The question is, do we need to budget for our broader impacts activities? The simple answer is, if it's going to cost you something to do broader impacts, you absolutely need to put it in your budget, right? I've seen proposals when I've been on a review panel where they say, we're going to build, 500 science kits, and we're going to distribute them to elementary schools all across our state. And it's going to be great. And students are going to learn all about electricity and magnetism, or the food web, through these science kits we build. And then you go to the budget, and there is $0 in there for building those science kits. And, it tells me a couple things. One, they're not going to be able to do that because they don't have any money to do it, and it's not free. But number 2, it tells me they haven't been thinking big picture. They haven't thought all the way through this if they haven't thought to include it in their budget. So I want evidence that people have thought through all the details, including how much is it going to cost, and is that represented in my budget? The next question I always get is a much harder one to answer, which is, okay, well, how much, right? What's reasonable? What's appropriate? And there's really not a good answer for this because, every project is different. Some projects do a better job of leveraging existing resources, where other ones, by necessity, need to create a lot of things from scratch. As a general ballpark, and I'm hesitant to say this because I always feel like as soon as I do it, people write down this number and think it's dogma. But, as a general ballpark, maybe a starting point of 10% of total direct costs for broader impacts, it is, is not going to raise any red flags, most likely. But again, I want to emphasize, I've seen really fantastic broader impacts plans that leveraged a lot of existing resources and ended up costing way less than 10%. And I've also seen plans where they budget 20%, and the broader impacts, I can tell by looking at it, is garbage, and it would never work, even if they spent 100% on it. So it's really case by case. And this is another example where sitting down with you and looking at your individual proposal, I can give you a much better sense of, I did science outreach for over 20 years. I know what it costs to run these programs. And then, you'll hear from Max from the museum in a minute, and he'll tell you a little bit probably about what it costs him to work with him to put up an exhibit or to do a series of activities. So you talk to your partners, you talk to me, you get some sense of, what it's going to cost to do these things. Because the budgeting is important. And the biggest red flag is if you're proposing to do all these wonderful, ambitious things, but you haven't budgeted any money for it, that's a real warning sign that people haven't been thinking through all the details. I've already mentioned this, so I won't beat it into the ground. Just remind you, you can't wait till 3 days before the grant is due to start your broader impacts. and hope to have a really good broader impact section. And I'll tell you, as someone who's been on panels, we can always tell when someone has done that. It's so obvious when they've, just thrown something together at the end. But if you want to have those partnerships that really make it a more effective project, you're going to have to start sooner. It takes a while to identify partners. I know a lot of the people. I've been in this area now. I came here 28 years ago, and I've been working in outreach and science for 28 years in the Triangle. I know a lot of the people in this area. I'm happy to help connect you to people, but it takes time to make those connections and to work out a plan and to get them to, agree to write a letter of collaboration and send it to you and all that. So you just can't do it 3 days before the deadline. So, give yourself enough time. Again, I could go on all day about how to evaluate or assess your broader impacts. All I will tell you is that you have to do it, right? The NSF has an expectation that in your proposal, there will be a well laid out plan for how you're going to collect data to demonstrate your broader impacts activities are effective. And if you don't have the evaluation piece in your proposal, it's another red flag. It's low hanging fruit, and the review panelists are going to ding it, and they're going to say, it was an interesting idea, but there's no discussion of evaluating how they're going to evaluate it. Now, evaluating broader impacts activities is essentially social science research. And for many of us, we're trained as biologists or chemists or physicists or engineers. And so social science research is not something we probably receive much training in, if at all. The good news at Duke is that we have the SSRI, the Social Science Research Institute, and they're fantastic. And I refer people to them all the time and say, talk to Jessica in SSRI. She's amazing. She'll work with you. She'll help you come up with an evaluation plan. And, you can even write in some amount of money into your budget, $5,000 a year or whatever, and they will consult and they'll run your evaluation for you. You can do the evaluation yourself, and they can just sort of consult you and give you some ideas on how to do that. I can give you the basics, but I'm not an evaluation expert. But the good news, without belaboring this, is that we have the SSRI. They're amazing. They're experts, and that's a good place to start. So that's all I'll say about that for now. But I'm happy if we meet one-on-one to talk more about evaluation. Couple more really quick things. For those of you under the age of 30 who are on this call, this is a telephone. This is what they used to look like. And I show this to make the point that you should always, no matter what NSF grant you're writing, you should always reach out to your program officer, the NSF program officer. They're happy to talk to you. Actually, I showed a telephone. They would probably prefer that you start with email. That's probably a better way to start, but they will get on the phone with you or get on Zoom with you and answer questions. And in fact, I put a link, or not a link, but just a title in the bottom right corner. It's a website called NSF 101, 5 tips on how to work with an NSF program officer. And so if you just Google that, it'll take you right to that document. And it's a really good page for giving you strategies for how to work most effectively with your PO to get the most out of them. They want to see you be successful, and they want to help you be successful with your proposal. And so they'll give you great information. And sometimes that information might be, your idea is interesting, but it's not really fundable the way it is. But, come back when you can address this, or they might say, this is a great idea, but it would actually be a better fit for this other division or this other directorate within the NSF. So I would encourage you to reach out and consider submitting it there instead of here, So, they're obviously not going to write your grant for you, but it's surprising how much useful information they can give you. So absolutely contact your program officer. And the other thing is, as soon as you are eligible, as soon as you are able to do it, reach out to the NSF and volunteer to be on an NSF review panel. It's a ton of work. They're going to give you a bunch of grants to read. It's stressful. Usually happens during the semester when you're busy with your research or your classes or your teaching or whatever. But I honestly believe that the single best thing you can do to improve as a grant writer is to serve on an NSF panel and learn how the sausage is made and hear those discussions that go on around the table. And every time I come away from serving on a panel, I feel like I have better insight into how to write grants effectively. So as soon as you're eligible and you feel like you have the time, I encourage you just to reach out to the NSF, introduce yourself, and say, I'd love to be considered to serve on a panel. And they're always needing panelists, so it's not like it's competitive to do, I mean, semi-competitive, but they're always happy to hear from people who want to do that. All right, last couple slides are just mentioning some resources, and then hopefully Max is here, and I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about working with the museum. But I want to just repeat this guiding principles document. The newer version that we updated, it looks a little bit different on the cover. We have a 2.0, and the link that I gave you is a link to the newer version of it, but you can download it as a PDF. Really great resource. Shouldn't try to write an NSF grant without it. The next thing is I want to encourage you all, and this is also linked in the PDF that Tim put in chat, is to use this tool called the Broader Impacts Wizard. I sent out a video to all of you that signed up a couple days ago, and it's a video from the front page of this Broader Impacts Wizard. This is a free web resource. It's fantastic. It was produced initially by my colleague, Janice McDonnell, who's at Rutgers University and is a member of she's another ARIS co-PI, so I work really closely with her at ARIS. And she and the rest of the ARIS team sort of recently revamped it and put together a 2.0 version, which is what you see here. And this will give you all the information that I've given you today and walk you through step by step, including text input boxes where you can type in responses, and then at the end, it doesn't save your data or your ideas or anything, but at the end you can print out a document which has sort of all of your ideas refined in an outline form for your broader impact section. It even has a feature where it looks for keywords based on the text that you put in, and based on those keywords, it will pull out relevant citations. So, that you can have references. I see that you're considering citizen science. Here's some great references, in publications on citizen science, so that you can have those references as well. Because most of you, if you're a chemist or a physicist or a biologist, you probably aren't up on the current literature or even the seminal literature in outreach or engagement. So this is a way to get that without having to delve into that field of literature. And then the last thing I'll say is I said I don't like bullet point lists, but this is a list, and I encourage you, grab a screen grab or something if you want. But just a bunch of resources here at Duke and in the Triangle. So obviously I would suggest you consider starting with my office, the Broader Impacts Resource Center. I also want to encourage all of you to reach out to the Office of Campus Research Development, or OCRD, which is an office run by Sohini Sengupta, and she can help you. I focus on broader impacts, but she can help with sort of the more holistic things, including the intellectual merit and the budgeting and pulling all the pieces together. And she can even organize what they call a red team, which is sort of a mock review panel before you submit your proposal. So definitely consider reaching out to them. The Durham office, or the Duke Office of Durham and Community Affairs, is a great way to connect with groups throughout the Durham community. If again, I mentioned the SSRI is the obvious starting place for help with evaluation. And then outside of Duke, the museums. We'll hear from Max in just a second about working with Museum Life and Science. There's also the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh. There's Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center at UNC, go Tar Heels. There's, working with local schools. So many people at Duke, by the way, go to the North Carolina School of Science and Math, which is an amazing school and an amazing resource. And you're working with brilliant kids. And it's an obvious place to go if you want to partner, a community partner for doing broader impacts work. But it shouldn't be the only one you think about, right? Those kids at Science and Math are so smart. They're going to be fine. Whether you work with them or not, they're destined for success, right? They're all way smarter than me, right? But think about going to schools that have less in the way of resources and don't have scientists going into their classrooms to work with them, and maybe don't have a lot of first gen students and things like that who haven't had the opportunities and the resources. Those are the places where you can really have an impact. So I'm not saying don't work with science and math, but you shouldn't only think about working with science and math. local Boy Scout groups or Girl Scout troops or 4-H clubs, or if you go out into the more rural counties, Future Farmers of America. Work with in the Triangle before COVID, at least, we had 3 different, at one point 4 different science cafes. My group, the Science and Society Initiative, ran periodic tables in Durham. Moorhead Planetarium ran one in Chapel Hill. The Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh ran one. And then I think there was even a 4th one. And hopefully those will be coming back when life gets hopefully back to normal. But you can also do really great public and community engagement through local farmers markets or through the North Carolina State Fair. I see that I mentioned here that you could work with Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and I saw someone in chat mention that as well, or local senior centers. So it doesn't always have to be people working with kids; it can be working with seniors. Then I just list a bunch of different organizations if you want to focus on broadening participation. So SOCNIS is an organization I've worked with for 20 years. It's Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. NSBE is National Society of Black Engineers. ACES is American Indian Science and Engineering Society. WISE is Women in Science and Engineering. If you want to do work with students with disabilities, start with Duke's SDAO, Student Disability Access Office. If you want to work with LGBTQ communities, start with Duke's CSGD, sorry. There's a lot more. I just couldn't fit it all on the slide. But the point is, it's not just local high school or host an underrepresented student in your lab in the summer. There are so many other potential partners and resources out there. So I want you to think about that and talk to me, and I'm happy to help connect you with those, as well as sit down and brainstorm with you and help you read drafts of your proposal and that sort of thing. Really quickly, I'm going to introduce Max in a second, but I want to thank you. I want to remind you that I can be reached through my email address, jory@duke.edu. Let me know how I can help. And if you want to take a quick screen grab of this is a short evaluation for this session. I'll also send this link out to everybody by email. But if you want to do it now, that's great. But thank you for that. I want to make sure I give Max some time. We have 11 minutes left. So Max, if you're there, welcome everybody. This is my friend Max Colley. He works with the Durham Museum of Life and Science. Max and I have worked on broader impacts projects for several years now. He's a great guy, and I invited him here to talk a little bit about, I guess I need to unshare, don't I? To talk about his museum and ways you might consider partnering with the Museum of Life and Science. I also invited, Max and I have a colleague, Katie Alman, who does sort of Max's job at the NC Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it today, but she's another person that I could connect you with if you wanted to do projects there. But Max, thank you for being here, and please share with our group ideas you have for ways they might work with you and what that would entail.
Thanks, Jory, and thanks for the invitation to be here today, and thanks for all of y'all for a few minutes of your time. Yeah, so it's easy to think of museums as just sort of the set of exhibits or the space that they occupy, but actually museums and y'all, when it comes to broader impacts, are really closely aligned in our sort of set of goals. And one thing that I would say, and what I want to kind of use my time today to get across is, rather than like an advertisement for working with us for broader impacts, which I hope you will get in contact to talk a little bit more about, is this idea that museums do have 3 sort of major assets at play when it comes to broader impacts that we hope can be really useful to y'all as you're coming up with your NSF proposals. The first one is we obviously have a built-in audience. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the Museum of Life and Science, the museum that I work at, and that's really right down the street from Duke, we see somewhere between 500 and 650,000 guests a year. Other museums that Jory mentioned, some are bigger, some are smaller, but all museums do have audiences that come to visit them. And that's a pretty important piece of broader impacts, is making sure that you're getting your work out in front of people. Another thing that we have is robust partnerships with a lot of other groups that are similarly aligned. One of those is with public school systems. Another one is with public school teachers or other educators in the area. And then of course we have close partnerships with a lot of other stakeholders, schools, nonprofits, other informal education places and stuff like that, that can similarly sort of be leveraged towards common goals of having your research be in front of members of the public. The very last one, and I'm glad that Jory brought this up, is that museums have expertise in some of the stuff that you all may not. As experts in your various fields of science, one thing you may not be an expert in is talking to kids. The museum is really good at reaching a variety of a bunch of different audiences. And often when folks initially begin to think of who they could partnership or go into partnership with for the broader impacts, you can come to a museum early on and say, who is it that you actually have expertise in reaching? And museums do have expertise in reaching a lot of different audiences and are actually excited about doing some of the stuff that you may be less excited about doing. So I'll share my screen here. Like I said, this does, like Jory, I also don't like lists, bullet lists. This has a few because this also sort of acts as our menu of what it is that we might do. But I wanted to use some of my time again to talk about why partner with museums just generally. This is from a researcher named Colleen Dillenschneider. The very first one is, you can see museums there are highly credible sources of information in society. Here's another one that shows that museums are largely seen as being apolitical. They are looked at as being not having political agendas compared to a lot of other places. And the basic thing to take away from these data is museums are highly credible places. They occupy a place of massive public trust in society. When we think about that, when it comes to broader impacts, one thing that I like to use these data for is to talk about, we're ready to leverage a lot of that public trust towards the projects that you are working on, towards a real public good. So we have that massive amount of public trust that we're ready to sort of share out through a broader impacts partnership with all of y'all and sharing your work with society as well. A couple of things about the Museum of Life and Science. We have live animals. We have a lot of endangered animals and contribute to a lot of species survival plans. We have a extremely large butterfly house, the largest, I think, east of the Mississippi. We have 84 acres of outdoor space, including a lot of spaces that we use for research programs, like this large 10-acre wetland that we have. We have drop-in spaces, including a new tinkering space that really just opened up. And then, of course, we have indoor and outdoor exhibits, including all of this stuff on long-term loan from the National Air and Space Museum. Actually, if you look at some of these exhibits over here on the left, these were developed partially in partnership through broader impacts projects with researchers. So doing exhibits programming is a thing that museums do sometimes. But like Jory said, it takes really a lot of intention and planning. Like I said, I don't really love these bullet programs, but I think some of these are important to talk about. And I also can send this out to you a little bit later on. Some of the impact is, obviously, there's a lot of people that visit museums, and we have infrastructure in place to leverage our partnerships to reach a lot more people. And that includes public schools, and it includes public teachers, who are great audiences for your broader impacts projects. Museums are generally good, and I will say the Museum of Life and Science, the one I work at, we also are really good at telling stories. Is really how we view a lot of our work. And we'd be really excited to help tell your story. We do that through visualizing data and discovery, collaboratively constructing curriculum, exhibit components, virtual content, adapting technical and specialized scientific information and data to public audiences, involving publics in your work, sometimes as human subjects through a program we call Living Laboratories, connecting you and your work to local publics, and like Jory said, evaluating outcomes, impacts, and educational effectiveness. Our museum has a dedicated evaluation team to take some of that kind of scary work, partially at least, off of your plate. And we are very good at doing formative and summative evaluation on projects, and especially broader impacts projects. So here's a little bit of how we do some of this stuff. We create innovative curriculum and program design for adults, teens, babies, K-12, lots of different audiences, public forums, collaborative art projects. We have vital, established, and trusted connections with a lot of different stakeholders in Central North Carolina, especially. pop-up programming and exhibit spaces, public programming and drop-in spaces that I talked a little bit about before. We do training and professional development for researchers and students on communication, designing and developing science education programming, or even content or copy for exhibit components themselves. And what we really love is that co-development or co-design alongside you. We really do look at ourselves rather as a service provider and instead as a colleague, an actual co-creator in this project alongside you. And then, like I said, applied formative and summative evaluation to ensure reach and educational effectiveness. And what's important to us are probably a lot of the same things that are really important to you. Co-creation, collaboration, advancing your cutting edge science research and understanding, but also building that foundational and fundamental science literacy that lies at the heart of your research as well. And this is especially how we look at it when we talk about K-12 students, or even younger than that. We do have programming that goes towards very, very young children and their caretakers. We're very, very motivated to make sure that all of your programs are broadening participation in science. And a lot of how we do that is through leveraging partnerships with our stakeholder groups that we work very closely alongside. We're interested in this work with broadening definitions of what science is, who does science, and who can do science. And then, of course, increasing the relevance of science, engaging the public in innovative approaches, and designing for meaningful outcomes. The last couple of slides I just have put in photos because it can be actually really hard to actually visualize what this looks like. So this is kind of what some of these projects have actually looked like in the past. We do a lot of virtual content and documentary work with researchers, on and off-site programming and outreach for these programs. You can also see some of the research happening on site at the museum there. We do training videos, digital curriculum, video work, public forums, collaborative art projects, public engagement with science projects, deliberation, dialogue-based learning, serious gaming, teen clubs, after-school groups, project-based learning, long-term engagement, especially with teens and young adults. Summer camps are a huge business at the museum. So is K-12 programming. There's me holding a snake like 7 years ago at the museum or something like that. Really, what I'm most interested in today is this is not enough time to probably convince you to work with museums or with us, but I hope that it at least gets you sort of thinking about what might be possible. And I'd be thrilled to talk to you more about all of this stuff later on. So if it's been a little while since you've been to the museum, you can check out our website. You can feel free to email me. And I would be really thrilled to meet you at the museum, talk a little bit more about how we can advance some of our common goals. I'll leave this slide up here for a second, but that's really all I had planned. I think I went over 5 minutes. Sorry, Jory.
No, that's no problem. Thank you, Max. Yeah, I want to thank you. I know I didn't leave you a ton of time, but working with local museums is it can be tremendously rewarding. They've got such expertise. They do such amazing things. Way before I ever did broader impacts, early in my career, I had little kids that I took to that museum all the time, and we were members of that museum. And then it was so cool. Eventually in my career, I started actually doing a lot of work with them, but I felt like it was a home to me, and I had raised my kids there. And there's something special, as you all know, especially if you have kids of your own, about a museum like Life and Science, where it just becomes sort of like a backyard to you, and you spend all your time there, and your kids just, becomes part of their world. And so to then be able to work with them in that professional capacity is, I think, really rewarding and really fun. And it's just an awesome place. So filled with really friendly people like Max. So I want to open it up. If anybody has questions, I just want to encourage you to feel free to unmute and ask your question. There were a couple great questions in chat, and I tried to answer them, and I'm happy to elaborate. But first, I'll just open it up if anyone has questions for me or Max. Can you comment quickly on what the scoring sheet looks like for reviewers regarding BI and the most common themes of discussion during the study section? Well, common themes, I can only tell you what I hear regularly in the panels that I'm in, and I've pretty much only served in panels for either the biology directorate, because that's my training, or EHR, which is education and human resources. So I don't know what they talk about in engineering or computer science, but they're looking for a lot of the things that I've mentioned. Is there a strong rationale for why you're proposing to do this? Have you lined up the right partners to actually ensure that you have the pieces in place to be successful? Have you clearly explained the steps that you're going to take to make sure this works? Have you elaborated on an evaluation plan so that people, so that you can collect data to demonstrate that you're actually having the impact? Really a lot of the points that I made today are based on the kinds of conversations that we have in the review panels. The scoring sheet, there's the standard template that the NSF gives to all their reviewers, which is, in these categories, talk about the strong points of the proposal and, the concerns you have and that sort of thing. And that's just sort of a standard template for all review panels. I don't know if individuals create their own broader impacts scoring sheet, but I use this as my guideline, right? And, I know this inside out now because I've been working with it for so long, but this was created specifically to give to reviewers, to give them a template to help them evaluate broader impacts more effectively. So if you want to sort of create a score sheet as a reviewer or as a grant writer, if you want to address those points, again, I would start with this document. Other questions? I know it's now a couple minutes after 11:30, so I understand if people have to go. If you do, thank you again for being here. I'm also happy to stick around. I don't know if Max has to run, but I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes if there are other questions. Okay, well, Max, I think we're done for the day. I guess we get to hit the bars now. If anybody has any questions after this, okay, Ken, we'll get to your question one second. I was just gonna say, if you have questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me, Jory@duke.edu. I can connect you with Max as well, and we're happy to talk. Yes, Kent.
Oh yeah, sorry, I asked one earlier in the chat. In regard to, because you had mentioned kind of first generation high school, do we need to, should we, or do you recommend spending a paragraph in the BI section kind of describing, giving personal details of family, personal hardships like that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I did try to address it quickly in the chat, but
sorry, I missed that.
The answer is absolutely. If part of your narrative, part of your story is that you were a first-gen student yourself, and that really, there was someone who inspired you and made you want to pursue a career in STEM, and they were a difference maker in your life, and it would mean a lot to you to be able to become that person for future first-gen students, I would absolutely include that in your narrative. That's very compelling, and I think sometimes people are a little hesitant because they feel like, as scientists, we're often trained, it's not supposed to be personal, it's not supposed to be about us, and it may not work as well in your intellectual merit, but for the broader impacts, if you can present that compelling narrative, that rationale for why you're choosing to do what you're doing, to me as a reviewer, that sends a message of authenticity, and it tells me, that you've got this passion that's coming from a place of authenticity, and so that's very important to me. That makes a big difference. And that is the kind of thing that we'll discuss around the review panelist table. We'll say, well, this person was a first-gen student and now they want to work with first-gen students. That's a real strength. So absolutely include that narrative. I get variations of that question where people say, as an African-American woman in engineering, I feel like I'm not comfortable saying that explicitly in my proposal because I don't want it to seem like I'm taking advantage of that. And I have a couple responses to that. Is, one is you're in a group or a couple of groups that have been marginalized and underprivileged and underserved and under-resourced for the entire history of science. So, if anything, we need to be doing more to create more opportunities for you. But beyond that, it's not exploitative. You're not being dishonest or disingenuous. You're saying that as a, not me, but as a, a female Latinx engineer, I am personally aware of the obstacles, the lack of role models and the obstacles that I've faced And I feel like I could be a particularly good role model because I've been through that. I've had those experiences. I could connect with students who are in that situation. And to me, that sends a message of authenticity that is really powerful. And I'm not saying that me as a white male, I couldn't be inspiring to students, but I don't have the same authenticity with that particular group of students that scientist, that engineer would have. So I absolutely think it's not exploitative. You're not taking advantage of anything. You're simply saying, this is what I'm saying as a person who speaks from this point of authenticity.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. What examples of BI approaches would you advise for hard sciences, theoretical modeling, that are a few steps away from cool applications? Should we focus on applications even though we won't deal directly with them? A very common question. Every time I work with mathematicians or computer scientists or physicists, I get variations of that question. There's a long answer, and the long answer is we should have a meeting and we should sit down and we should come up with ideas, and I can give you examples. The short answer is, there are ways to do it, and it's always helpful to pull it back to something that makes it relevant to your audience's life. So if you're working on something that's very arcane or esoteric, it might feel like it's daunting to try to make that seem relevant. But those of us who've been working in BI for a long time have seen lots of good examples of ways that people do that. And Max, you've probably seen a lot of good examples in your work at the museum. So reach out to someone like me or Max, and we can sit down with you and sort of brainstorm and give you some suggestions for ways to approach that. But it can definitely be done.
And science fundamentals, like fundamentals within the field that you are working, is an applicable and relevant and good way to at least frame some of your broader impacts in the case where it can be really hard to think about those cool applications that might be kind of far away.
Yeah. I mean, I always say that everybody should do their research at the Duke Lemur Center. I mean, what could be easier than doing, public engagement with the cutest little animals in the world, right? But if you don't happen to be a lemur researcher, we can still work with you and help you find ways to make your research seem really cool. Maybe not as cuddly, but definitely cool. Any other questions? All right, well, Max, thanks again for being here. Tim, thanks for doing all the behind the scenes work. Thanks to all of you who've stuck around and had questions. Again, just encourage you all to reach out, let us know how we can help, and I will follow up with a bunch of resources and a link to the evaluation if you haven't had a chance to fill that out yet. But thanks for being here, and we're here to work with you and support you, so let us know how we can do that. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Jory.
Thanks, Max. Talk to you soon.
Bye.